On September 11, 2001, almost 3,000 people died in a coordinated terrorist attack on U.S. soil. This single morning ignited what would become the longest war in American history. The U.S. government quickly identified the architect of the attacks, Osama bin Laden. His al-Qaeda network was operating out of Afghanistan under the protection of the ruling Taliban. President George W. Bush issued a clear ultimatum: hand over bin Laden and dismantle the training camps, or face a military response. The Taliban refused. Less than a month later, on October 7th, the U.S. and its allies launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Instead of a massive ground invasion, the CIA and U.S. Special Forces partnered with the Northern Alliance, a coalition of local Afghan militia groups that had been fighting a civil war against the Taliban for years. Backed by overwhelming American air power, this ground partnership advanced rapidly. By mid-November, coalition forces captured the capital city of Kabul. Within 2 months, the Taliban's Islamic Arad collapsed entirely, and its fighters were driven from every major population center. To the outside world, it looked like a lightning-fast, decisive victory. But on the ground, the reality was fractured. The operation had dispersed the enemy forces, but it failed to capture the primary targets. Bin Laden and top officials had slipped through the cracks. Rather than surrendering, figures like bin Laden and the Taliban's founder, Mullah Omar, retreated into the rugged terrain of the Tora Bora Mountains. From there, they crossed the porous border into neighboring Pakistan, finding safe haven in the loosely governed tribal regions. Right as the hunt for these leaders required intense, sustained focus, the U.S. began diverting military intelligence, special forces personnel, and crucial resources toward a new impending invasion: Iraq. This pivot created a massive operational vacuum in Afghanistan between 2002 and 2005. While a newly formed Afghan government tried to establish itself in Kabul, the surviving Taliban leadership used the lack of international pressure to quietly raise funds, recruit new fighters, and rebuild their military networks from across the Pakistani border. What was originally designed as a highly targeted, retaliatory strike to dismantle a terrorist network had morphed. By taking their eyes off the fleeing leadership, the coalition allowed the remnants of the Taliban to organize into a vast, patient insurgency. The objective in Afghanistan expanded well beyond hunting al-Qaeda. The coalition was now attempting to build a functional democratic state from scratch in a country fractured by decades of conflict. This phenomenon, where a military objective continuously expands past its original parameters, is known as mission creep. In 2006, the revitalized Taliban pushed back across the border, launching a highly coordinated offensive. They targeted the fragile Afghan government, utilizing roadside bombs, suicide attacks, and ambushes to seize control of rural districts where the central government had little reach. The international community scrambled to respond. NATO took command of the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, expanding its military presence outward from Kabul to try and secure the volatile southern and eastern provinces. This chart shows the sheer scale of the ensuing military buildup. From a minimal footprint in the early 2000s, coalition troop numbers spiked dramatically. By 2010, the intervention included forces from 51 different countries, with peak troop strength exceeding 130,000 personnel on the ground. Yet, flooding the country with international soldiers and billions of dollars in development aid could not pacify the rural strongholds. The Taliban operated among the local population, leveraging deep tribal ties and a shadow governance system that dictated entirely different rules of engagement. The surge years became defined by brutal, grinding turf wars in southern provinces like Helmand and Kandahar. Coalition forces found themselves fighting intense, daily battles for isolated compounds and narrow dirt roads. Then, in May 2011, U.S. Navy SEALs located and killed Osama bin Laden at a compound in Pakistan. With the architect of the September 11th attacks dead, the American public largely expected that the war in Afghanistan had finally reached its logical conclusion. But the conflict raged on. The coalition possessed a trillion-dollar technological advantage, complete with drone surveillance and precision airstrikes. The Taliban, relying on light arms, improvised explosives, and a deep willingness to absorb massive casualties, simply took the blows and replenished their ranks. If overwhelming military supremacy and the deaths of the primary target could not break the strategic stalemate, military leaders faced a hard truth. The coalition could clear a village, but they couldn't hold it indefinitely. Fighting their way to a permanent, decisive victory was a mathematical impossibility. By 2015, NATO officially ended its combat mission. The intervention transitioned into a new phase called resolute support, shifting the coalition's role from leading the fight to training and advising local forces. The burden of frontline combat was handed over entirely to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, or ANDSF. These local troops were now tasked with holding back the insurgency while relying heavily on American air support and logistics. Back in the United States, political patience had run dry. After nearly 2 decades, multiple presidential administrations, and mounting casualties, public support for the war had largely evaporated. This exhaustion culminated in February 2020 in Doha, Qatar. The U.S. government bypassed the Afghan administration entirely and negotiated directly with the Taliban. They signed an agreement that established a hard, fixed timeline for a complete withdrawal of all American troops. Announcing a definitive exit date shattered the strategic power dynamic on the ground. The Taliban no longer needed to defeat the Afghan military in a prolonged head-to-head conflict. They only needed to wait out the clock until the international air support and logistics networks disappeared. As the U.S. military rapidly drew down its forces in the summer of 2021, the Taliban launched their final sweeping offensive across the country. Without coalition air support and maintenance contractors, the Afghan military's logistics collapsed. District centers and provincial capitals fell in a rapid, domino-like succession, often with local forces surrendering after running out of food and ammunition. The climax arrived with stunning speed. On August 15, 2021, Taliban fighters walked into the presidential palace in Kabul. The Afghan Republic had completely fallen, and the Taliban reclaimed total control over the state apparatus. The human cost of the 20-year conflict is staggering. Over 176,000 people were killed, including more than 46,000 Afghan civilians. Millions more were left as internally displaced persons or forced to flee the country entirely as refugees. 2 decades, trillions of dollars, and countless lives later, the timeline ended exactly where it began. The Taliban restored their Islamic Emirate over Afghanistan, leaving behind a stark, permanent lesson on the absolute limits of foreign military intervention.